All right, again, the invitation is still open. If you'd like a free dinner back there, please help yourselves. But we're going to go ahead and get started. And this is a big night for HealthyU. Every session has been in the past, but I would introduce myself. I do see some repeat people, which I always love to see that. My name is Patty Roberts. I'm the Deputy Director here at the City of Port St. Lucie Parks and Recreation Department. It's been my pleasure to create and facilitate HealthyU we're now in our third year. Yes, and we cover some very, very tough, sensitive topics. Tonight is very timely. I don't know, can I see a show of hands for whomever saw, what was it, Channel 25 news last night or this morning? That lady back there. They came out and interviewed us, both Ann and I, the presenter. And the one question that I thought was so appropriate was, why depression in November, is what she asked me. And for once, Patty usually hesitates, but for once I was spot on. And I said, my word, I said, you've got inflation, okay, that I know is impacting my community. And then you've got the affordable housing situation in Port St. Lucie. And then you've got the holidays coming. That's just a recipe, okay? And so we have got a subject matter expert here in Ann Posey, and I'll read her bio and tell you a little bit about Ann. But I will just give you a brief synopsis of HealthyU. Again, 3 years old, and we're morphing, we're evolving through the times. We're also going to be bringing in, and I apologize, I'm trying to maneuver on this cane, but I want to introduce you, and I gave you some literature on the next HealthyU movement, if you will. We're going to really be covering some new topics, okay? So there should be a flyer in your materials there that's going to cover all 12 months of 2023. And my vision for 23 is we're going to hopefully continue doing the exact same thing that we're doing tonight, and that is that a meal will be provided at each of the HealthyU sessions. All right. I am desperately seeking sponsors for this program. I have sponsorship packets up here. So if you know, at the end of the evening, if you know of any organization or business or friend who might be interested in sponsoring a HealthyU session, you can do them individually, you can do them collectively, but we do need sponsors to help us offset the cost. So we thought that would be a nice addition to HealthyU, since our program starts at 6:30. So looking forward to that in 23. But my big thing with HealthyU is the topics that we're going to cover. And I'm not going to read off the flyer, but I am going to highlight a few of them that are new and different for the next year. Some of the staples we'll bring back. Depression, anxiety, those are two of the most, and I'm not an SME like this lady is, but those are two very common mental health challenges. So we'll pretty much always be talking about those. The opioid epidemic, which is the one near and dear to my heart, we'll pretty much be talking about until there is no epidemic. And for those of you new, that is how HealthyU got born, if you will, is I lost my son, Danny Roberts. He was 22 years old back in 2018, August 18th. And he died of a heroin overdose that was laced with fentanyl. And for me, the important message is Danny did not die in Orlando. He didn't die in Miami. He died right here in Port St. Lucie. And so the minute I was, not that you ever heal, I'm still not, but a little over that, I started thinking, I am not going to sit at my house for 8 years, which I did, while Danny struggled through his addiction, and thinking I'm alone in this. And that's ergo where HealthyU came from. So we talk about some tough topics. Again, like we talked about on the news last night, the goal of HealthyU is to raise awareness, educate the public, and reduce the stigma attached to many of these mental health challenges. It is truly my hope, and I think it'll happen in my lifetime, that we can talk about some of these diseases like depression, like opioid addiction, in the same breath and context that we talk about my husband's heart condition or my neighbor's diabetes. That's my hope, is so that we're not in the closet talking about these diseases when at the end of the day, they are a disease. So, and you're going to learn more about that from Ann tonight. But some of the new topics that we're going to be covering very briefly. In January, we're going to talk about what is a healthy versus unhealthy relationship for a teen. Then we're going to talk about homelessness and its impact on the Treasure Coast community today. We're going to talk about adoption. Then we're going to talk about resilience building, substance use disorder, alcohol. I have never had that topic in HealthyU because that's not my lived experience, but it's definitely needed here in Port St. Lucie. We'll talk about bullying. We always, every year, talk about suicide awareness. Again, opioid. But another one we're going to do is on post-traumatic stress disorder. And we're going to have a panel of veterans that will come to us and speak on PTSD, speaking on telemental health. And the last one is going to be on depression and holiday stress. So that's the lineup for 2023 HealthyU. Every program is free and held here in this room. And God willing, with a sponsor, we'll have food to get people through the hour. And so that's HealthyU. The next HealthyU event is going to be just about 1 month, well, less than 1 month, on December 7th. It's a Wednesday again. It'll close out the 22 HealthyU programming. And that topic is going to be on anxiety. And that's a very, very common ailment and challenge that many of us, myself included, suffer from. So I encourage you to invite your family and loved ones to come out and hear about anxiety. And then the last thing I want to mention before I turn it over to Ms. Posey is we've also developed a brand new program. And it's under the umbrella of HealthyU, but it's called the Wellness Connection. Has anybody heard of that? Okay, the Wellness Connection is launching December 1 of this year. It's going to rotate. It's a quarterly session on health topics. So think of HealthyU as mental health. Wellness Connection is health. And all of this comes from our community. All those topics I just read to you about are people that have come up to us, either, you know, the Ann or to me through the years and said, can you talk about this? Can you talk about that topic? And so that's what we did with Wellness Connection. So we're starting on 12/1, they're going to be Thursday evenings, and we're going to rotate each one of the 4 quarterly sessions throughout the city, so that we can get out and meet, get to the people in their communities. So the first one is going to be over at the Mid-Florida Event Center on 12/1 at 6:30, just like we do here. And the topic that night is going to be diabetes and education. And I've actually got the presenter for that is from Cleveland Clinic, Martin, and she's the dietitian there, who in charge of their diabetes center. So some real talent coming to us talking about diabetes. There, each one of the Wellness Connections will be not just like, but like this, where you'll come in and have a free meal and hear from a subject matter expert. That's the first topic in December. Then in January, we're going to meet back up, and that one's actually going to be up at the Oxbow Eco Center, if everybody knows where that is, up on St. James. And that topic is going to be heart health. And I've got the American Heart Association coming out and doing that presentation. The next one is in April, and that session is on tobacco and vaping cessation. And we're having that over at our Minsky Gym on the west side of town. And the last session for next year of Wellness Connection is in July, and that is going to be on how to access healthcare. I'm very spoiled. I have an employer who I have a great medical plan. I also know a lot of people who do not have that amenity, and navigating that health plan is challenging. So we're going to have an expert talk to us about how you do that. So I just wanted to be sure, especially our HealthyU veterans, that you know about Wellness Connection and the opportunity there. You can, all of the sessions coming up, you do need to pre-register for. And that is on our website. One second, on our website, on the HealthyU portion of it. And the reason we need pre-registration is because the capacity is going to be limited to 50, the first 50, and also to get a head count for the meals. Yes, ma'am. There, if you recall, that was Hurricane Nicole. Yes, ma'am. I had to reschedule. It broke my heart. I had to reschedule that. So now it's December 1st. Yes, ma'am. And again, 6:30 at the event center on US 1. So we'll have that one. That one, register, again, pre-register. Excuse me. Earlier today, I did look at the numbers for diabetes, and we had, I think, 37 registered. So there's only 50 capacity. So if you're interested, sign up. Okay. So that was enough, and I'm sorry, Ann, for cutting in. However, I'm going to now read this woman's qualifications, and then she's going to present to you why you're here, and that is on the topic of depression. Ann Posey has joined Tykes and Teens Incorporated as the Chief Executive Officer effective November 7th of 2022. So she is fresh. Fresh. Ms. Posey comes to Tykes and Teens with 25 years of experience in behavioral health and healthcare systems leadership in agencies across Florida's Treasure Coast. She most recently served as the Regional Administrator of Behavioral Health for Cleveland Clinic, Florida, and the Administrator of Neuroscience, Orthopedics, and Rheumatology for Cleveland Clinic, Indian River Hospital in Vero Beach, Florida. That was where I actually had the pleasure of meeting Ms. Posey, is when she was with Cleveland Clinic, Indian River. She has done a number of HealthyU sessions, and each one is met with just resounding positive remarks from the attendees. Ms. Posey holds a Master of Arts in Clinical Psychology from Marshall University in Huntington, West Virginia, and she is a licensed mental health counselor in the state of Florida, as well as a nationally certified counselor. She has extensive leadership experience in systems that serve youth, including behavioral health, child welfare, and juvenile justice. Ms. Posey enjoys serving her community and is on the board of several local nonprofits. So you may be you may be wondering, what is Tykes and Teens? Has anybody ever heard of Tykes and Teens? I'm sorry? Have you ever heard of Tykes and Teens? What? Yes, ma'am. I had not before I started this journey on mental health. Tykes and Teens is huge in our community, and they are a wonderful partner to HealthyU. So I just want to briefly talk about who Tykes and Teens is, because they're so integral in our program. But they've been a leading mental health care provider for children and adolescent evidence-based programs and services for 26 years. So it's not like they're brand new. With a mission of prioritizing children's mental health in our families, schools, and communities through a wide range of prevention, education, and treatment programs and services, Tykes provides affordable, quality mental health services for children in Martin, St. Lucie, Okeechobee, and Indian River counties, comprising Florida's Treasure Coast. You can follow Tykes and Teens on Facebook, Instagram, or LinkedIn. So that's my introduction to Ann Posey. I'm now going to, probably very slowly, but I'll get there, move out, and Ann is going to speak to us on depression.
Thank you. It's okay. I'm a little overdressed. So I'm 7 days with Tykes and Teens, and this is, so in the 7 days I've been there, we had a hurricane. And then it's their big festival week. So in Stewart, the Festival of Trees and Lights. If you get a chance to go by the Flagler Center, there are beautifully decorated trees and wreaths that are available to be raffled off. And so there have been several events. I was at an event this afternoon, and so I'm still dressed for that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about depression, and the title of my talk is Depression, Not Just Singing the Blues. And the reason that I use that topic is when we talk about depression, we aren't just talking about a bad day or, having, feeling kind of down here and there. We're actually talking about a syndrome and a mental health disorder. All right. Just a minute. So I'm not advancing. I think we can find our. Yes, let me get back in here. Okay, for a minute. A little clunky, but all right. So what is depression? Depression is a common but serious mood disorder. And as I said, it's not just singing the blues. The reason we talk about depression as a syndrome is you have to have symptoms that are present for at least 2 weeks consistently. So depression impacts the way you think, the way you feel, and the way you handle your daily activities. It can be a very debilitating diagnosis. So how common is it? It's actually one of the most common mental health disorders in the United States. Estimated that almost 5% of adults experience regular feelings of depression. And people with depression tend to go to their doctor first. So where do you go when you don't feel well? You go to your primary care physician. So primary care physicians are actually one of the largest prescribers of antidepressant medication. And we know that about 10% of people who see their primary care physician have a diagnosis of depression on their chart. We see over 45,000 suicide deaths per year. And we've seen the rate of suicide increase to about 14%, and that's a huge increase over the last 20 years, almost a 35% increase. So suicide is really an epidemic. I did a talk on suicide not too long ago where we talked about those things. So what could be wrong? What are the types of depression? Depression is major depressive disorder is probably the most common diagnosis of depression. So major depression disorder, there's a common syndrome of symptoms that go with major depression disorder. Feeling sad every day, almost all day for a period of 2 weeks or more, difficulty sleeping, falling asleep, staying asleep, and awakening early in the morning. It's a very classic kind of sleep pattern. People report problems with their appetite, feeling hopeless, helpless, worthless, and then having suicidal ideation. We know that it affects more than 16 million adults over the age of 18. And while it can develop anytime, we see it most of the time developing around the age of 32. So we think depression's more prevalent in women, but my theory is that's because women are more likely to report depression than men. So they'll talk about it more often. My guess is men feel depressed just as often as women do, but they just don't report it. And about 35% of adults with major depressive disorder never receive treatment. How long do you think it takes for people to seek treatment from onset of a symptom of depression till the time they actually get help? What would you think? Okay, years. How many? 5 years? Any other guesses? Yeah, actually 10. It's about 10 years generally from onset of symptoms. So when they did my little news spot today, I said, if you broke your arm, you probably wouldn't wait 10 years to get treatment for it. And if you did wait 10 years to get treatment for it, you would probably have a lot of secondary impact, right? You would probably lose the ability to use your arm. You would have a lot of chronic pain. You might not be able to work or perform your duties or activities of daily living because your arm is broken. And you might get an infection, so there are a lot of secondary things that happen. This happens with depression as well. So when people wait 10 years or more to get help for depression, then they start to see secondary effects. People aren't able to work. They might lose their job. They might lose family relationships because they aren't able to function effectively. And so my mission and my hope is that we teach people to recognize the signs and symptoms of depression and that they get help when they get the onset of symptoms rather than waiting years and years and racking up all these secondary effects. Sorry, I got to figure out how to go back now. There's another type of depression called persistent depressive disorder. We used to call that dysthymia, which basically is chronic low-level depression. So it's not necessarily as serious as major depressive disorder, but it's people who will tell you they just feel sad all the time. But people who have persistent depressive disorder can kind of go in and out of major depression. So they might have periods of extreme lows. Postpartum, that's something we actually see a lot of, postpartum depression. And again, it's often something that people don't talk about. Having a baby is supposed to be an incredibly happy time. But for some women, they can get severely depressed to the point that they may think about harming themselves or their child immediately following the delivery. And you think about the fact that maybe you have this postpartum depression and you're already not sleeping and you're tired and exhausted, and it makes it very difficult for these women to complete daily tasks. And so we talk about this now. We try and talk about it with women who are going through childbirth, that the baby blues, because sometimes people will say, oh, you just have the baby blues. Postpartum depression is much, much more serious. Other types of depression you might see, there are people who have what is called psychosis sometimes when they get depressed. So they could have hallucinations, delusions. Typically, people who have a psychotic depression has a theme. So I'm worthless, I'm very guilty or shameful about things. And they might hear maybe voices telling them that they should end their life. We see seasonal affective disorder. So how many people struggled with the time change? I struggle with the time change. It's way too dark, too early. And there are actually some people with lack of sunshine that experience what's called seasonal affective disorder. So they get more depressed in the winter. And there are all kinds of things you can do with light. Some people move to states where it's brighter, like Florida. And then bipolar depression. So bipolar depression is, bipolar illness is a mood, considered a mood disorder where your mood swings. And people get a little confused about bipolar disorder because they think they have extreme highs and extreme lows. But bipolar depression, you can just go from normal to low to normal to low, normal to low. And really the way sometimes we diagnose bipolar as opposed to major depression is by what medication works. So with major depression, antidepressant medications work much more effectively, while with bipolar disorder, there's a class of medications called mood stabilizers, things like lithium or Seroquel or some mood stabilizers that are a little different than antidepressants. So how do I know if I have depression? What are the signs and symptoms of depression? So generally, like I said, with depression, we're looking at symptoms that happen most of the day, nearly every day, for at least a period of 2 weeks. And not everyone who's depressed experiences the same symptoms. Everybody's different. So I talked about some of these: persistent sad or empty mood, feeling hopeless, feeling pessimistic. Irritability is actually a big symptom of depression. So people will feel edgy and will be snappy, right, and irritable about things for maybe no good reason. Feelings of guilt, worthlessness, or hopelessness. So I've had people say to me, it would be better off if I wasn't around. I'm no good to anybody. But when you talk to the people in their lives, that's not an accurate statement. They are very important to people. They do have worth, but the feeling is that they don't. A loss of interest in things. So if somebody really enjoys knitting, It's like, well, I just don't have the energy, or I don't feel like doing it anymore. Maybe they're gardeners and they just don't get out and garden. They just lose interest in the activities that used to give them pleasure. And then they'll report feeling very tired all the time. I just want to lay in bed. I don't want to get up. And often, we talk about these secondary symptoms, the family members will often interpret that as they're being lazy, or they just don't want to participate. And if you just pulled yourself up by your bootstraps and tried to do something, you'd feel better. People with major depression can't. So they would if they could. No one wants to be that miserable, but the depression is such that they can't do that. And then moving or talking slowly. So you see this really kind of presentation of someone who feels sad and down all the time. And a lot of times families or friends will say, I don't understand why they feel that way. They have nothing to make them depressed. But depression doesn't have to do with necessarily stressors. It really is a biochemical imbalance. You'll also see people who feel restless. They can't sit still. They can't make decisions or concentrate. And then this very specific sleep pattern. So they'll tell you, I can't fall asleep. When I do fall asleep, I wake up about 2 or 3 in the morning and can't go back to sleep. And I feel very anxious during that time. And that's a really common sleep pattern for people who are depressed. You'll still see people who either don't eat much or who overeat. So one of the things we look for in major depression is anyone that's had a significant weight loss over a short period of time, usually 20 pounds. You'll see people just drop weight just because they don't have an appetite. Thoughts of death or suicide, or actually attempting to end their life, is a symptom of severe depression. And then people will get what we call somatic symptoms. So what that is, I just don't feel good. I feel achy. I feel tired. My stomach hurts. And they go to the doctor and the doctor says, there isn't anything physically wrong with you. And then they'll say, you mean it's all in my head? Because we have a real stigma, right, about having depression. No, well, it may be a mental challenge, but it's a very real syndrome. So what are the risk factors of depression? So current research says that depression is a combination of our genetics, our biology, the things that go in our environment, and our psychological factors. So has anyone ever heard of ACE scores? So ACE scores stand for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And there was a study done actually with middle-aged white women, someone who looks like me, who were facing surgery or were looking to have surgery for obesity, severe obesity, 400 pounds or more. And what they found is that women who were obese had more adverse childhood experiences in their background than other women not facing surgery. So things like grew up in a home where there was divorce or domestic violence or mental illness or substance use disorder, had witnessed a crime, had witnessed maybe a murder or a suicide in their life. So there's a whole list of them. So we know that people who have a high ACE score, so they have a number of adverse childhood experiences, are more prone to be depressed. And that's the impact of trauma on how we function. So anyone who's been through trauma, whether it's physical abuse, sexual abuse, crisis like going through Hurricane Katrina, 9/11, any of those types of things can make people more prone to depression. We also know that as we get older, and in midlife or as older adults, people who have chronic medical conditions tend to get depressed. So diabetes, cancer, heart disease, Parkinson's disease. We actually, when people have heart attacks now, or they do cardiac rehab or have bypasses or stents, we screen them for depression because we know that they're much more likely to experience depression following a serious heart condition. So having those kind of long-term chronic illnesses can be very wearing on us, and it can also change our biochemistry. All right. So we should be aware of that. And then sometimes medications can make us feel depressed. So people who take chronic medication, especially pain medication, can find themselves in a depressive state. So those are some risk factors that we want to look at, if we feel that we're struggling with depression. I always talk a little bit about suicide when I do talks on depression, and I'm not going to do a full-fledged talk on suicide like I did a couple of months ago, but I think it's important to understand and to talk about suicide because it's, once again, something that we don't talk about. I teach mental health first aid and I have a slide about that towards the end of my talk. Mental health first aid is like the CPR for mental health. So CPR, how many people in this room have been trained in CPR? Probably majority, right? Now, are you trained to do heart surgery? No. So if you come across someone who has signs and symptoms of a heart attack, you're trained to recognize those symptoms. You're trained to provide some emergency support until you can call 911, get the paramedics there and get them to a professional to deal with whatever's going on. Mental health first aid is the same thing. So with mental health first aid, we want to train people to recognize signs and symptoms of mental health challenges, to know how to talk to people experiencing a mental health challenge, and then get them to an appropriate professional for treatment. And so one of the things we teach in mental health first aid is how to ask the question, do you feel like harming yourself? Do you feel like you might commit suicide? And to use those words, and I'm sorry, I try and get away from using commit suicide because that is, we want to say now die by suicide because there's a lot of negative connotation around the word commit, right? We commit crimes, we commit adultery. So we really don't want to talk about suicide in that same vein. But depression can be a terminal illness, and some people die by suicide as a result of their depression. And people will say, well, if I ask about it, you might put the thought in their head, or I don't want to bring something up, that maybe I don't know how to deal with. But in mental health first aid, one of the things we teach is that if someone's thinking about ending their life by suicide, it's happening in the dark. And if we ask them about it, we can bring it into the light, and then we can help and do something and get them to an appropriate person. So we know that about 12 million adults have seriously thought about suicide, and 3.2 million adults have actually made a plan, and 1.2 have actually made an attempt. For about every one person that dies by suicide, about 25 attempt. The suicide is higher amongst females, right, amongst females than males, but we really believe that's because women attempt more often because they tend to use non-lethal means, overdose, where sometimes it's not successful, whereas men tend to use more lethal means like guns. So I don't know that that statistic is really accurate. And we also know that people ages 85 and older have some of the highest rates of suicide, especially following the pandemic. And there's a term for this we use now called deaths of despair. So the pandemic really for people in the older age group was really devastating. The sense of isolation, losing people that they cared about in their cohort, other people that they may have known dying from COVID. And we've started to see those rates increase. And our suicide rate has risen to 14%. So it had dropped for a couple of years in Florida, but it's starting to rise again. So I mentioned COVID. I know we're all tired of talking about COVID, but COVID is a crisis that is only seen once in a generation. It's the type of thing, that has happened once in my lifetime. I think the last Spanish flu was the last pandemic we had, and I'm not old enough to remember that. So it's important to talk about the impact of COVID. So 4 in 10 adults now report symptoms of anxiety and depression, where in 2019 it was 1 in 10. So if you think about that, over the last 3 years, we've increased by about 300% the number of people who feel anxious and depressed. And we know with any disaster that we're going to see what we call a mental health surge following the end of that disaster. We saw it after 9/11. We saw it after Hurricane Katrina. We saw it after World War II. We see an increase in mental health challenges following any type of pandemic or disaster. So 12 to 14 months after the end, we expect to see what the mental health surge. So that mental health disorders will rise by about 4 times what they are normally. So we've seen suicide deaths increase during the course of the pandemic, especially males ages 10 to 34 and people of color. And this statement by Christine Modier, an individual's personal risk combined with things such as isolation, depression, anxiety, economic stress, suicidal ideation, and access to lethal means may lead to increased periods of suicide. So I think right now we have all of that. You know, we have isolation, we have economic stress, we have a political climate right now that's very challenging. So all those things, especially for someone already predisposed to depression, can make a very lethal combination. And then we're in Florida, where we rank about 47th in access to mental health care in the United States, but we rank 3rd in gun sales. So our money doesn't really go towards helping people with mental health challenges. I hope that's something that we change over the course of years. I'm not saying take away people's guns. I'm just saying, let's put some money towards making access to mental health care more available for people in our community. So this is a chart just showing the increase in depression and suicide. And you can see, you know, we're going up and up. So following disasters, you see mental health challenges. You also see substance use disorders. So we talked about the opioid epidemic. We've seen overdose deaths increase since the pandemic. People are isolated. They're looking for ways to relieve their anxiety and depression. A lot will turn to substances. We also know that long-term exposure to stress causes our immune systems to weaken. People will have heart problems, obesity. Anybody gain the COVID-20? I did. So because we were isolated, we didn't have a lot to do. So we turn to comfort sometimes, comfort foods. And then people will experience depression and sleep disorders. Following the pandemic, we've seen that 70% of Americans feel that the economy is a significant source of stress. That's up from 46%. That's a huge increase, almost double. 1/3 of Americans show symptoms of anxiety, depression, or both. And it's up to half to people with financial difficulties. 1 in 5 Americans report a physical reaction thinking about the pandemic. I feel it in my gut. I will tell you, I worked in healthcare. I worked in a hospital system during the pandemic. There were days where physically, I didn't know if I really wanted to get up and go to work because I knew what the stress level was going to be at work. And even now, we still see in healthcare a lot of stress around the pandemic. People, you know, we're still in masks. I still say we because I've only been gone from Cleveland for about 2 weeks. But we're still in masks at Cleveland, and that's, you know, politically, there are a lot of people who disagree. So people get angry and upset when they're asked to wear a mask. So 18% report they feel anxious almost all the time of Americans now. And we saw text messages to disaster hotlines increase by 1,000% during the pandemic. So we know people are stressed, we know people are upset, and we know the pandemic has been a big factor. So if you see the emotional phases of a disaster, I like this slide. This slide is from the Critical Incident Stress Association. And I will tell you, I think we're clearly right now in the disillusionment phase. So everybody remembers pre-disaster probably. We heard there was this virus out of China. maybe it was going to be something we needed to worry about, but we weren't really concerned it was going to impact us. So we had some warning, and then we started seeing some cases. So we started feeling some of the threat. And then we saw the impact of the pandemic. We actually started getting cases and seeing it, on the news. And then we moved into the heroic phase. Everybody remember that, right? We were doing things for everybody. I worked in healthcare. There were parades, there were signs, people brought food. We masked for 2 weeks to stop the spread, right? We were all heroes. And that's really common when you're facing a disaster. We get in that heroic mode. Then we feel like maybe we've solved this problem, and we kind of coast a little bit. But then we fall into the disillusionment phase. And I think clearly we're in this, and this can last for years, where, I'm tired of the pandemic. I don't want to do the things. I don't want to be heroic anymore. We're seeing the results of the economic crisis. People lost their jobs. Kids moved back home. People didn't get to do normal things. And so we really feel pretty horrible about the whole thing and tired and depressed. But we do know we'll come out of it eventually and move into the reconstruction phase, and we'll have a new normal. It won't be the same normal that we had before the pandemic, but we'll get to a period of more normalcy. So 9/11, we could clearly see this pattern during 9/11. We always had heard there might be a threat, but we really didn't attend to it. The 9/11 happened, and everybody was heroic. I remember interest rates on cars went to zero. Everybody went out and bought a car because we're supporting the United States. We were all, there. And then we started doing things like having to take our shoes off in airports, right? And people were very disillusioned about that kind of stuff. They didn't want to do it. But do you even think twice now when you go through an airport and you have to take your shoes off? It's no big deal, right? It's our new normal. So we move on and we adapt, and we're very resilient. So again, psychological casualties usually outweigh physical ones 4-to-1 during a disaster. We have the mental health surge. Pandemics are different than a situation like 9/11 because they're ongoing. And they're exhausting, and it's not like a one-day event and then we recover. It's been, we said 2 weeks to stop the spread, and it's been 2.5 years where we are now. So what can we do? What kind of treatments are out there for depression? Well, we do know the earlier treatment begins, the more effective it is, because we stop those secondary effects that tend to complicate things. So it's much more effective if we can get treatment early. As I said, my mission is to encourage people to, just like if you broke your arm, you would go see somebody about that. When you feel you've been 2 weeks and you feel depressed, you go and you say, I think I'm depressed, to a professional so that they can help, rather than trying to hide it or not talk to anyone. And people delay due to stigma. We still have this big stigma about mental health, that somehow it's not a real disease, and it's a real disease. The gift of the pandemic is that we talk about mental health more, and we're much more accepting of it. And that's one of the gifts, I believe, of the pandemic. People often don't want to see a psychiatrist because of the stigma. So they'll go to their family medical doctor, they'll go other places to get help, but they don't go to a specialist. So break your arm, you go to an orthopedist. Have an ingrown toenail, you go to a podiatrist. Have a heart problem, you go to a cardiologist, and you want to see that specialist, right? Because you want to see the person that's best at what they do. Yet people won't go to a psychiatrist who is the expert in mental health care. So what happens, and I will tell you, I work with lovely primary care physicians who want to be helpful, but a lot of times if they start medication, they start it at a subtherapeutic dose. They'll say, let me give you a low dose of this medicine to see how you react. And they don't give a therapeutic dose because they don't work with these medications every day. Why it's important to see a specialist, someone who's trained in these disorders. So there are all kinds of different treatments for depression. No one's the same. treatments work differently for different people. Medication is a very effective treatment for depression, right? I take an antidepressant medication. So the pandemic was very hard on me. You know, I started noticing I was having trouble sleeping. I'm 61. I've never had a bout of depression up until this time, but I thought, you know, I think I might be getting depressed. And so I went in and negotiated with my doctor for a medication I thought would help. And it did. So we want to ensure that we talk about medication, because medication helps with the biochemistry and the biochemicals in our brain. Psychotherapy. I am a licensed mental health counselor. I'm a big believer in therapy, either on its own or in conjunction with medication. The gold standard is cognitive behavioral therapy, which I'll talk about in a minute. Some people benefit from that combination of medication and therapy. That's actually what I tend to recommend for people, because I think it helps people get better faster, to do both. There are some brain stimulation therapies out there, electroconvulsive shock treatment. Anyone see One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest? Not like that. I mean, it's a movie we all see, but it is one of the worst depictions of the types of treatment available. So electroconvulsive shock treatment is actually very effective for people who have what's called refractory depression that doesn't get better from any other means. It's usually not a first line of defense, but it's done under anesthesia, and it is not at all a difficult procedure. And then self-help. I'm also a big believer in self-help, you know, and I think there are things you can do to help depression. Exercise is a really great way to help depression. When we exercise, we produce endorphins, which are our body's natural antidepressants. If you ever watch the marathon, that's my favorite Olympic event, because you're watching these people with like zero body fat, but they're running, and about mile 23, they look like they are going to die. Like they're barely running, you know, they just look like they just aren't going to make it. And then they get this burst of energy to complete the race, and they run across the finish line, you know, quite perky. That's probably an endorphin burst, which is, again, the body's natural antidepressants. Women in childbirth have higher levels of endorphins than people do normally. So it's also a natural painkiller. So exercise, self-help type of thing is something that can be very helpful for people. I'm going to talk a little more in depth about those different kinds of treatment. So antidepressants improve the way your brain uses certain chemicals that control mood or stress. The thing about antidepressants, and this is when people go to their primary medical doctor, sometimes they don't get this information, is that when you start an antidepressant, you're going to have some side effects from it. Dry mouth, constipation, you might feel groggy or lethargic. And those symptoms, side effects, usually last 2 to 4 weeks. It also takes about 2 to 4 weeks to see the benefit of the antidepressant medication. So what happens is people start their medication and they go, this isn't working for me. I'm still depressed, plus I feel crappy now, right? So they stop it in the first month, and they don't give it time for the side effects to lessen and the benefit to help them improve. And so we always encourage people to give antidepressants about a 3-month trial, because you really can't know the effects, whether it's working or not, for about 3 months. Sometimes when people take antidepressants, they feel better. So then they decide to stop taking their medication, and then they have a relapse. Blood pressure medication, anybody prescribe blood pressure medication and then decide that my blood pressure's fine, I'm going to stop it? Well, your blood pressure's fine because you're taking blood pressure medication. But people will do that. People don't finish courses of antibiotics. They get a 10-day course. They stop at day 7 because I feel better. And then we have treatment resistant infections because we haven't finished our antibiotics. So as a society, we're really bad about finishing courses of treatment. But if you're feeling better and you're on antidepressants and you feel like going off, you should do it in consultation with your doctor because you don't want to have a relapse. Therapy, there's several kinds of therapy out there. Talk therapy, where you sit down with someone, either one-to-one or in a group, and talk about what's going on. I'm a big believer in finding evidence-based practices. So those are therapists who are trained in therapies that have been proven to work through the evidence, through studies. So cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, is the gold standard. Cognitive thoughts, behaviors, what we do, our actions, and connecting our thoughts with our actions. We also have a form of CBT called dialectical behavioral therapy, which is skills building, teaches people how to control their behavior, building skills. Those are great forms of therapy. So when people seek therapy, I encourage them to ask, do you do evidence-based therapy? What kind of therapy do you do? Not just we're going to sit and chat, okay? Because you don't want to just sit and chat. You want to get better and feel better. Short-term solution-focused therapy, or what's called problem-solving therapy. That might be if you're having a stressor or something's going on, you go to therapy in kind of short bursts, 4 to 6 weeks. If you're feeling better, you might take a break from therapy, but if you have a recurrence, you might go back again. I like short-term focused therapy. I worked with people who say, well, I've seen my therapist for 5.5 years. And I'm like, okay, are you better? You know, because what we want you to do is be better and not have to go to that therapist every week, right? So evidence-based practices. So I talked a little bit, and I'm not going to go into all this slide, about brain stimulations therapy, ECT, usually done outpatient, usually 3 times a week. It's not painful. They do it under anesthesia, but what it does is seem to reroute the brain chemistry through electricity. TMS, that's actually something that is used more often now. It's transcranial magnetic stimulation, and they use a magnet to do something similar to ECT to disrupt those brain waves, and then vagus nerve stimulation. So again, if you're looking at a treatment like that for depression, usually it's because traditional methods haven't worked. And so you're trying something a little non-traditional, but for some people they can be life-saving. Self-help, be active, exercise, set realistic goals, try to spend time with other people. So one thing about depression, it's a very isolating illness. So people will tend to isolate and stay by themselves. And so sometimes just getting people out and saying, you know, take a walk with someone, you know, be with people, even if you don't want to be with people. I will tell people, fake it till you make it. So I don't really want to go, but I'm going to go anyway. Expect that your mood's going to improve gradually, not immediately. So we are a society of immediate gratification, right? I go on a diet, I don't lose 10 pounds tomorrow, I'm not finishing that diet. Not working for me. Most things that are worth anything take time and consistency. So we want to make sure that we're doing the same thing when we're trying to treat our depression with self-help. If you're depressed, it's the time to postpone major life decisions, right? So this is the time to decide you want to leave your spouse, or you want to get married because that's going to make me feel better, or change jobs, right? We want to feel better before we make those major life decisions. So stigma is one of the reasons why people live with mental illness and they don't get help. At some point, everybody, I think, who's experienced depression or anxiety has had someone blame them for the disorder. Well, if you would just get out more, you would feel better. If you would just quit hooking up with, you know, losers, you wouldn't feel depressed, right? They've been blamed for their depression. They've been saying, if you only tried, it's just a phase. And so then people feel ashamed and feel like somehow they've done something wrong and don't seek help because who wants to seek help if you're at fault? And it prevents people from getting the help they need. So if you already are depressed and you're carrying this really heavy burden, I think it's unacceptable to add to their pain by blaming them for their illness. So here are some common ways that you can combat stigma, and I really encourage people to do that. So talk openly about mental health. So I have some quotes. I fight stigma by talking about what it is like for me to have bipolar disorder and PTSD on Facebook. Even if it helps just one person, it's worth it for me. TikTok. So I try and stay up with the times. So I watch TikTok. A lot of people are talking about their mental health now on TikTok. They're talking about their symptoms, how they feel, different things. And so we're combating that stigma. Educate yourself and others, and educate them. If you suffer from a mental health challenge, educate people about what you feel and how you feel and what you do about it. Learn about it. So in this quote, I take every opportunity to educate people and share my personal story and struggles about mental illness, no matter where I am. If I overhear a conversation or rude remark about mental illness, I try and take it as a learning opportunity. I will tell you, the media portrays mental illness in a very negative way. I mean, how many times have we watched Law and Order, and somebody's portrayed as having a mental illness and they killed somebody? That's very unrealistic. Less than 1% of people with mental illness actually harm other people, but they're much more likely to harm themselves. Be very conscious about language, how we talk about mental illness. We're, oh, that person's just crazy, right? Not a really great term to use. So language matters. And if we can learn, and I still struggle with language, I use committed suicide, and I'm really working on that. I'm just old, and it's a term that's been around a long time. So instead of that, I try to say die by suicide, right? Because we don't say people committed cancer, we say people died from cancer, right? And that's less stigmatizing. Encourage equality between physical and mental illness. There is not equality between physical and mental illness. We live in Florida. Healthcare is pretty available here. People come, they see their doctors, their specialists, but we don't have very many counselors and psychiatrists. There is not equity. Insurances often have carve-out plans for behavioral health, making behavioral health care much more expensive than physical health care. Think about if we had a walk for depression like we do for breast cancer. Think about the money that goes to breast cancer from the Susan B. Komen walk that we do every year. People wear pink, people talk about it, football teams wear pink. Everybody's talking about breast cancer and raising incredible amounts of money. We aren't there yet with behavioral health and mental health. And then show compassion for those with mental illness. Our homeless population, a high percentage of our homeless population suffer from some type of mental illness. It really started when we deinstitutionalized back in the 70s. And that was an important thing. We needed to close some of those long-term facilities where people were warehoused all their lives with mental illness. But what we didn't do when we opened the doors was provide services. And so we see a lot of people struggle and are homeless and unable to do the things they need to do to live a life that's productive for them. So rather than sometimes we can be not very compassionate with those homeless folks or with people with mental illness, we should always try and remember that they're suffering. I often am the person that gets called, at least when I worked at Cleveland Clinic, if someone was having kind of a little meltdown in our lobby, because people want to avoid that person. And I'm always like, I'm in, all right, because I want to be able to show compassion for that person. Choose empowerment over shame. People with cancer have really learned to do this. They're empowered. I'm going to take charge of my treatment. I'm going to learn everything I need to know about it. I'm going to wear shirts that say I'm a cancer. They're empowered, right? We need to do the same for mental health. You know, we need to, if we're struggling with a mental health challenge, we need to learn about it. We need to advocate. We need to fight against that stigma. We need to be honest about the fact that we're getting treatment so that other people know it's okay to get treatment, right? We need to share that story. We need to let the media know when they're being stigmatizing. I bet when you leave here and you watch TV over the next couple of weeks, you'll start noticing those storylines that are negatively stigmatizing those with mental illness. Pay attention to that. Write the producer. Say, don't do that anymore. And don't harbor self-stigma. Don't hide in shame because you may struggle with anxiety or depression or trauma. When we hide, then we create that own stigma ourselves. And then we should use destigmatizing language. So rather than saying people have a mental health condition, we should say they have a mental health condition as opposed to a brain disorder or a brain disease, right? Mental health condition is, people are more accepting of that. Consider saying mental health instead of mental illness, right? We want to talk about our mental health and how to make things better rather than talking about the fact that people are ill. So a phrase like my daughter has bipolar disorder rather than my daughter is bipolar, right? Are we our diagnoses? We should not, do we say my daughter is cancer? Do we say my husband is heart disease? No, we say they have that. It's one part of the person. It doesn't define who they are. But it's very easy to do that. Working in behavioral health and working in behavioral health hospitals and medical hospitals, you know, I would go into staffings and people would go, so we have the schizophrenic in room 421. And I would say, you mean Mrs. Smith in room 421 who has schizophrenia, right? Very different. When we define people by their diagnosis, we dehumanize them. And we don't think about the fact that they're someone's mother, someone's brother, someone's sister, that they may have worked and had a job and been a productive member of society. And then we stigmatize people. We should say a person with mental health condition as opposed to a consumer, client, or patient. So again, having a mental illness or a mental health condition, see, I did it again, having a mental health challenge is not the entire person, but when we define them by that, we take away the rest of their identity. I noticed that Patty said, I have lived experience with the opioid crisis. That means that she has experienced it in her own life. And saying has lived experiences is much less stigmatizing than suffers from afflicted or mentally ill. So we say a person has lived experience with depression than saying they are mentally ill. It's less stigmatizing. Suicide attempt or attempted suicide, we want to say failed suicide. We want to say that instead of failed suicide or unsuccessful attempt. So frankly, if someone attempts suicide and they fail, that's a success, right? We don't want to, say, oh, they made an unsuccessful attempt. It's like we want them to successfully end their life. No, that's not what we want, but that's kind of that stigmatizing language. Died by suicide or suicide death as opposed to successful or completed suicide. Again, I don't consider any suicide successful. Someone may, though, have died by suicide. Took their own life as opposed to committed suicide. And dies as a result of a self-inflicted injury as opposed to chose to kill themselves. So I've worked with a lot of people with suicidal thoughts and who have ended their life by their own hand. And I don't think any of them chose that path. It was an end result of an illness that they struggled with throughout their lives. And I believe, again, if we change the way we talk about it, people are going to be much more accepting. And disclosed instead of threatened. We say people threaten suicide. No, they're disclosing that they're having suicidal ideation so they can get some help. Threatened is, again, a very negative term. I'm going to put resources up, but I want to talk about a little bit about holiday depression. And I keep walking away from this camera. Sorry. This is the holidays. I probably should have put a slide in here about holiday depression, but a lot of people struggle with depression. The holidays are very difficult, and a lot of people have a lot of sadness around the holidays. And it's a very difficult time of year because we're supposed to be happy, right? And Hallmark Channel, anybody got to watch it on speed dial, right? The Hallmark Channel. The Hallmark Channel will tell you, you have a problem, it's the holidays, and we're going to resolve it in an hour and a half, and everything's going to be better, right? And that's not how life is. That's, we see all these commercials, people coming home for the holidays and these big family reunions, and not everybody's life is like that. So what I encourage people to do is really take care of themselves during the holiday season. Learn how to say no. Often we overstress and overburden ourselves during the holidays. We often spend too much money because somehow we're trying to make up for something and buy all these gifts that then we get the credit card bills in January, and can really impact us. With the economy the way it is now, everything's much more expensive. We need to be able to sometimes create our own traditions during the holidays. So if you've had losses during the holidays, or maybe this year, maybe you lost a spouse or a parent or a child, and you had these traditions, and it's sad because you can't have those traditions anymore. Make new ones, right? Don't expect that people are going to behave during the holidays. So I always love this, right? We invite all our family that we don't see most of the year because we really maybe don't really want to see them a lot of times. And then we expect everybody to come together and behave. But Uncle Joe drinks too much, and Aunt Sally's going to gossip, and somebody's going to talk to the kids, and somebody's going to get in a fight, and it's really stressful, right? It's like vacations. Same with vacations. We put everybody in a car, spend a lot of money, and go places that maybe we really don't want to go, but we feel like we should, like Disney World, and everybody's tired and stressed after it's over. So think about it during the holidays. You don't have to be the one to cook the entire dinner. You can ask for help. You don't have to invite people that you don't really like to your house during the holidays just because they're related to you. That's okay. You don't have to do that. If you're alone during the holidays, sometimes finding somewhere you can volunteer or somewhere you can give back can be incredibly helpful. So take some time during this season to really look at your traditions and the things that you do, and make sure that you're taking care of yourself, right? So some resources. In this community in Florida, we have 211. So 211, you can dial 211. You can actually go on the computer and type in 211.org and get a whole host of resources for mental health, for housing, for domestic violence, for substance use disorder, all kinds of different things. It also acts as a suicide hotline for the state of Florida. But in July of this year, we actually rolled out a national suicide hotline, which is 988, very similar to 911. So anyone in the United States now can call 988 and talk with a counselor if they're feeling suicidal. I put up the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, but frankly, I would encourage people to use 988. Easier to remember, going to get you the same thing. Some different websites. National Institute for Mental Health has a lot of information. NAMI, the National Alliance for Mentally Ill, started as a support group for families of people who have lived experience with family members with mental illness. So I used to work for Cleveland Clinic Behavioral Health Center, so that's why that's up there. Also Tykes and Teens. There are a number of agencies that can help. take a mental health first aid class, sorry. Mental health first aid, like I said, it's the CPR for behavioral health. It's an 8-hour course taught to lay people. So you don't have to have any experience in mental health to learn about it. It's a great course. We taught it to our caregivers at Cleveland because we wanted them to be able to recognize in the moment someone who was struggling and be able to give them resources because everybody was struggling so much during the pandemic. You can usually find a free class. Just go Google mental health first aid, put in your zip code, and you can probably find a class. Our goal is to get everybody in the United States trained in mental health first aid, just like they're trained in CPR. Sorry, I choked up a little bit. And then 988. So that's our National Suicide Prevention Hotline. So that's my presentation. I'm willing to take questions if you have any questions, or if you would prefer after I end, you can come up and talk with me privately. But I certainly thank you for your time tonight. Thank you. Hi, Jennifer. Okay.
What advice can you give to people who are struggling with depression? Like home remedies, like medication?
So I like a.
I apologize. Spoken about this at the beginning. When someone asks a question.
Sure.
Otherwise, the recording will not pick up your question.
So the question was, are there things you can do at home, maybe for someone who is resistant to medication or resistant to help? So self-help, again, I think is can be very helpful for some people. So I think I put some resources on there, self-help books. I'm a big workbook believer, so I like workbooks. If you go on Amazon, you can find some self-help depression workbooks that give actual exercises for things to do. I also am a big believer in talking with the person about what you see in them. Okay, so if, you know, look, I see that you're struggling, I see that you're depressed, I would love for you to talk to a professional. I'm willing to go with you, you know, if you're uncomfortable about doing that. But people have free will and they can choose to get help, not get help, or get the kind of help that they want. So again, if somebody doesn't want to take medication, and medication doesn't work for everyone, you know, get some exercise, talk with a friend, you know, find a support group. Actually, you can do a lot of support groups online, talk to a therapist, and just really encourage them to get help. And I think that sometimes, especially if you're a support person, you know, you try those less restrictive methods. And if they don't help, then you say, you know, maybe we should try something a little different. Did that answer your question? Okay. Sure. Yep. And meds aren't for everybody, you know. I think sometimes medication can help people get better faster, you know, because it helps them sleep better, you know, regulate some of those symptoms of depression. But a lot of people do therapy or self-help and get better. A lot of depressions will resolve on their own, 6 months or more. But for me, I don't know why I'd want someone to be miserable, you know, for that period of time. But I understand why people are resistant to medications sometimes. Yes, ma'am. Okay. Excellent question. So the question is, how do you tell the difference between psychiatry, therapy, and how do you know which person to go to? So a lot of times I encourage people to start with either their primary care physician, right? Or with a therapist where they can do a complete assessment and take a look at what's worked, not worked, what you've tried, what kinds of things are going on in your life to get kind of an assessment. The difference between psychiatry and therapy. So psychiatry, for the most part, and this isn't every psychiatrist, but for the most part, psychiatrists are prescribing and managing medication. Right? They're medical doctors, so they're prescribing and managing medication. And then a lot of psychiatrists will also have therapists in their office who do talk therapy. So again, therapy is kind of talking with another person. If you do cognitive behavioral therapy, that's the type of treatment that I choose to do. You're going to say, what are the behaviors you want to change? Let's talk about how your thoughts contribute to those behaviors, and try and do some things to help you change your thoughts so that your behaviors change. All right. We also have what we call advanced practice practitioners now, APPs, which are psychiatric nurse practitioners and physician assistants. They also tend to be people that prescribe medication. So that's the difference. Yes, ma'am. So there are a ton of therapists and counselors. So I work for Tyson Teens. We work with kids. We use evidence-based practices. So 211 will probably have your most comprehensive list of therapists and counselors in this area. And you want to, when you call them, you want to ask, do you do evidence-based practices? And you want to ask what your success rate is. So a good therapist is going to be keeping records of people who improve and people who don't improve. And if someone's not willing to talk to you about that information, then I would tend to shy away from them as a resource. That's just me, right? If I'm going to go to a doctor for cancer, I want to know, are you successful in treating it? And show me how show me how. So we can do a lot of pre and post tests for people who show that they feel better, or different kinds of things. So a good, successful therapist will be able to help you with that. I also encourage people to check the Board of Professional Regulation. So you want to make sure the therapist that you go to is licensed or supervised by a licensed therapist, and check them out on the board. We would do that with a medical doctor, make sure there are no complaints against them, no malpractice, that kinds of thing. You're welcome. Any other resource? Any other questions? Sorry. All right. Thank you so much for taking your time this evening. I appreciate it.